There were very few winters passed but what we'd lose a pinnacle. Mr. Lake expressed his concurrence with Mr. Warby's views of restoration, but it was to a fear about this point lest the story proper should never be reached. Possibly this was perceptible in his manner. Warby hesitated to reassure him. No, but what I could carry on about that topic for hours at a time, and do when I see my opportunity. But Dean Burscough, he was very set on the Gothic period, and nothing would serve him, but everything must be made agreeable to that. And one morning after service, he'd appointed for my father to meet him in the choir, and he came back after he'd taken off his robes in the vestry, and he'd got a roll of paper with him. And the verger that was then brought in a table, and they began spreading it out on the table with prayer books to keep it down. And my father helped him, and he saw it was a picture of inside of the choir in the cathedral, and the dean, he was a quick-spoken gentleman. He says, well, Warby, what do you think of that? Why, says my father, I don't think I have the pleasure of knowing the view. Would that be Hereford Cathedral, Mr. Dean? No, Warby, says the dean. That's Southminster Cathedral, as we hope to see it before many years. Indeed, sir, says my father, and that was all he did say. Leastways to the dean, but he used to tell me he felt really faint in himself when he looked around our choir, as I can remember it, all crumpled and furnished like, and then see this nasty little dry picture, as he called it, drawn out by some London architect. Well, there I am again, but you'll see what I mean if you look at this old view. Warby reached down a framed print from the wall. Well, the long and the short of it was that the dean, he handed over to my father a copy of an order of the chapter that he was to clear out every bit of the choir, make a clean sweep, ready for the new work that was being designed up in town, and he was to put it in hand as soon as ever he could get the breakers together. Now then, sir, if you look at that view, you'll see where the pulpit used to stand. That's what I want you to notice, if you please. It was indeed easily seen. An unusually large structure of timber with a dome-sounding board, standing at the east end of the stalls on the northern side of the choir, facing the bishop's throne. Warby proceeded to explain that during the alterations, services were held in the nave, the members of the choir being there disappointed of an anticipated holiday, and the organist in particular incurring the suspension of having willfully damaged the mechanism of the temporary organ that was hired at considerable expense from London. The work of demolition began with the choir screen and organ loft, and proceeded gradually eastwards, disclosing, as Warby said, many interesting features of older work. While this was going on, the members of the chapter were naturally in and about the choir a great deal, and it soon became apparent to the elder Warby, who could not help overhearing some of their talk, that on the part of the senior canons, especially, there must have been a good deal of disagreement before the policy now being carried out had been adopted. Some were of opinion that they should catch their deaths of cold in the return stalls, unprotected by a screen from the draughts of the nave. Others objected to being exposed to the view of persons in the choir house, especially, they said, during the sermons, when they found it helpful to listen to it in a posture which was liable to misconstruction. The strongest opposition, however, came from the eldest of the body, who up to the last minute objected to the removal of the pulpit. You ought not to touch it, Mr. Dean, he said with great emphasis one morning when the two were standing before it. You don't know what mischief you may do. Mischief? It's not a word of any particular merit, Canon. Don't call me Canon, said the old man with great asperity. That is, for 30 years I've been known as Dr. Alof, and I shall be obliged, Mr. Dean, if you would kindly humor me in that matter. And as to the pulpit, which I've preached them for 30 years, though I don't insist on that, all I'll say is, I know you're doing wrong in moving it, but what sense could there be, my dear doctor, in leaving it where it is when we're fitting up the rest of the choir in a totally different style? What reason could be given apart from the look of the thing? Reason, said Dr. Alof. If you, young man, if I may say so without any disrespect, Mr. Dean, if you only listen to reason a little and not to always asking for it, we should get on better. But there, I've said my say. The old gentleman hobbled off, and it was proved never entered the cathedral again. This season it was a hot summer, turned sickly all on a sudden. Dr. Alof was one of the first to go, with some affection of the muscles of the thorax, which took him painfully at night, and at many services the number of choirmen and boys was very thin. Meanwhile, the pulpit had been done away with. In fact, the sounding board, which still exists as a table in a summer house in the palace garden, was taken down within an hour or two of Dr. Alof's protests. The removal of the base, not effected without considerable trouble, disclosed to view, great to the exultation of the restoring party, an altar tomb, the tomb, of course, to which Warby had attracted Lake's attention that same evening. Much fruitless research was expended in attempts to identify the occupant. From that day to this, he has never had a name put to him. The structure had been most carefully boxed in under the pulpit base, so that the slight ornament as it possessed was not defaced. Only on the north side of it there was what looked like an injury, a gap between two of the slabs composing the side. It might be 2 or 3 inches across. Palmer, the mason, was directed to fill it up in a week's time, when he came to do some of the small jobs near that part of the choir. The season was undoubtedly a very trying one. Whether the church was built on a site that had once been a marsh, as was suggested, or for whatever reason, the residents in its immediate neighborhood had made them but little enjoyment of the exquisite sunny days and the calm nights of August and September. To several of the old people, Dr. Aloff among others, as we have seen, the summer proved downright fatal. But even among the younger, few escaped either a sojourn in bed for a matter of weeks or at the least a broadening sense of oppression, accompanied by hateful nightmares. Gradually there formulated itself a suspicion which grew into a conviction that the alterations of the cathedral had something to say in the matter. The widow of a former old verger, a pensioner of the chapter of Southminster, was visited by dreams, which she related to her friends, of a shape that slipped out of the little door of the south transept as the darkness fell in, and flitted, taking a fresh direction every night about the close, disappearing for a while in house after house, and finally emerging again when the night sky was paling. She could see nothing of it, she said, but that it was a moving form. Only she had an impression that when it returned to the church, it seemed to do in the end of the dream. It turned its head, and then she could not tell why, but she thought it had red eyes. Warby remembered hearing the old lady tell this dream at a tea party in the house of the chapter clerk. Its recurrence might perhaps be taken as a symptom of approaching illness. At any rate, before the end of September, the old lady was in her grave. The interest excited by the restoration of this great church was not confined to its own county. One day that summer, an FSA of some celebrity visited the place. His business was to write an account of the discoveries that had been made for the Society of Antiquaries, and his wife, who accompanied him, was to make a series of illustrative drawings for his report. In the morning, she employed herself in doing a general sketch of the choir. In the afternoon, she devoted herself to details. She first drew the newly exposed altar tomb, and when that was finished, she recalled her husband's attention to a beautiful piece of diaper ornament on the screen just behind it, which had, like the tomb itself, been completely concealed by the pulpit. Of course, he said, an illustration of that must be made. So she seated herself on the tomb and began a careful drawing, which occupied her till dusk. Her husband had by this time finished his work of measuring and described, and they agreed that it was time to be getting back to their hotel. "You may as well brush my skirt, Frank," said the lady. "It must have got covered with dust, I'm sure." He obeyed dutifully, but after a moment he said, "I don't know whether you value this dress particularly, my dear, but I'm inclined to think it's seen best days. There's a great bit of it gone." "Gone where?" she said. "I don't know where it's gone, but it's off at the bottom edge behind here." She pulled it hastily into sight, and horrified to find a jagged tear extending some way into the substance of the stuff. "Very much," she said, "as if a dog had rent it away." The dress was, in any case, hopelessly spoiled to her great vexation, and though they looked elsewhere, the missing piece could not be found. There were many ways, they concluded, in which the injury might have come about, for the choir was full of old bits of woodwork with nails sticking out of them. Finally, they could only suppose that one of those had caused the mischief, and that the workman who had been all about the day carried out the particular piece with the fragment of dress still attached to it. It was about this time, Warby thought, that his little dog began to wear an anxious expression when the hour for it to be put into the shed in the backyard approached, for his mother had ordained that it must not sleep in the house. One evening, he said, when he was just going to pick it up and carry it out, it looked at him like a Christian and waved its and was going to say, "Well, you know, how do they carry on sometimes?" And at the end of it, I put it under my coat and held it upstairs. And I'm afraid I'm as good as deceived my poor mother on the subject. After that, the dog acted very artful with hiding itself under the bed for half an hour or more before bedtime came, and we worked it so my mother never found out what we'd done. Of course, Warby was glad of its company anyhow, but more particularly when the nuisance that is still remembered in Southminster as the crying sit-in. Night after night, said Warby, that dog seemed to know it was coming. He'd creep out, he would, and snuggle under the bed and cuddle right up to me, shivering, and when the crying come, he'd be like a wild thing, shoving his head under my arm, and I was fully near as bad. 6 or 7 times we'd hear it, not more, and when we'd draw out his head again, I knew it was over for the night. What was it like, sir? Well, I'd never heard but one thing that seemed to hit it off. It happened to be playing about in the close, and there was the 2 of the canons met and said good morning one to another, sleep well last night. One says it was Mr. Hensel that one, and Mr. Lyle was the other. Can't say I did, said Mr. Lyle. Rather too much of Isaiah 34:14 for me. 34:14, says Hensel. What's that? You call yourself a Bible reader, said Mr. Lyle. Mr. Hensel, you must know he was one of us who used to be termed Simon's Lot. Pretty much what we would call the evangelical party. You go and look it up. I wanted to know what he was getting at myself, so I ran home and got out my own Bible, and there it was. The satyr shall cry to his fellow. Well, I thought, is that what they've been listening to these past nights? And I'll tell you, it made me look over my shoulder a time or two. Of course, I've asked my father and mother about what it could be, but before that they both said it was most likely cats, but they spoke very short, and I could see there was trouble. My word, that was a noise, hungry like as if calling after someone out that wouldn't come. If ever you felt you wanted company, it would be when you was waiting for it to begin again. I believe 2 or 3 nights there was men put on to watch in different parts of the close, but when they all used to get together in one corner, the nearest they could to the high street, nothing came of it. Well, the next thing was this. Me and another of the boys, he's in the business in the city now as a grocer, like his father before him, we'd gone up in the close after morning service was over, and we heard old Palmer the mason bellowing to some of his men. So we went up nearer because we knew he was a rusty old chap, and there might be some fun going on. It appears Palmer told this man to stop up the chink in the old tomb. Well, there was this man keeping on saying he'd done it the best he could, and there was Palmer carrying on like all possessed about it. Called that making a job of it, he says. If you had your rights, you'd get the sack for this. What do you suppose I pay you for your wages for? What do you suppose I'm going to say to the dean and chapter when they come round, as come as they may do any time, and see that you've been bungling about covering the old place with mess and plaster and Lord knows what? Well, master, I done the best I could, says the man. I don't know no more than what you do, how it come to fall out this way. I tamped it right in the hole, he says, and now it's fell out, he says. I never see. Fell out, says old Palmer. Why, it's nowhere near the place. Blowed out, you mean? He picked up a bit of plaster, and so did I, that was laying up against the screen 3 or 4 feet off and not dry yet. And old Palmer, he looked at it curious-like and then turned round on me and says, Now then, you boys, have you been up to some of your games here? No, I says, I haven't, Mr. Palmer. There's none of us been about here till just this minute. And while I was talking to the other boy, Evans, he got looking in through the chink, and I heard him draw his breath and say, he came away sharp and said to us, he says, I believe there's something in there. I saw something shiny. What, I dare say, says Palmer. Well, I ain't got time to stop about that. You, William, you go off and get more stuff and make a job of it this time. If not, there'll be trouble in my yard, he says. So the man, he went off, and Palmer too, and us boys stopped behind, and I say to us, Did you really see anything in there? Yes, he says, I did indeed. So then I says, Let's shove something in and stir it up. And we tried several of the bits of wood that was laying about, but they were all too big. Then Evans, he had a sheet of music had brought with him, an anthem or a service. I forget which it was, and he rolled it up small and shoved it in the chink. 2 or 3 times he did, and nothing happened. Give it to me, boy, I said, and I had to try it. Nothing happened. Then, I don't know why I thought of it, I'm sure, but I stooped down just outside, opposite the chink, and put my 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled. You know the way, and that what seemed, I think I heard something stirring, and I says to him, Come away, I says, I don't like this. Oh, rot, he says, give me the roll. And he took it and shoved it in, and I don't think I ever seen anyone go so pale as he did. I say, Warby, he says, it's caught or else something's got hold of it. Pull it out or leave it, I says, come and let's get off. So he gave a good pull, and it came away. Lessways, most of it did, but the end was gone. Torn off it was, and Evans looked at it for a second, and then he gave a sort of croak and let it drop, and we both made off out of there as quick as we could. Well, when we got outside, Evans says to me, Did you see the end of that paper? No, I says, only it was torn. Yes, it was, he says, but it was wet, too, and black. Well, partly because of the fright we had, and partly because that music was wanted in a day or two, and we knew there'd be a set out about it with the organist. We didn't say nothing to anyone else. And I suppose the workmen, they swept up the bit that was left along with the rest of the rubbish. But Evans, if you were to ask him to this day about it, he'd stick to it that he saw the paper was wet and black at the end where it was torn. After that, the boys gave the choir a wide berth, so that Warby was not sure what was the result of the mason's renewed mending of the tomb. Only he made out that fragments of conversation, dropped by the workmen passing through the choir, that some difficulty had been met with, and that the governor, Mr. Palmer Tewett, had tried his own hand at the job. A little later, he happened to see Mr. Palmer himself knocking at the door of the deanery and being admitted by the butler. A day or so after that, he gathered from a remark from his father, let fall at breakfast, that something a little out of common was to be done in the cathedral after moving service on the morrow. And I just as soon it was today, the father added, I don't see the use of running risks. Father, I says, what are you going to do in the cathedral tomorrow? And he turned on me as savage as I ever seen him. He was a wonderful good-tempered man as a general thing, my poor father was. My lad, he says, I'll trouble you not to go picking up your elders and betters' talk. It's not manners and it's not straight. What I'm going to do or not going to do in the cathedral tomorrow is none of your business, and if I catch sight of you hanging about the place tomorrow after your work's done, I'll send you home with a flea in your ear. Now you mind that. Of course I said I was very sorry, and that was equally, of course, I went off and laid my plans with Evans. We knew there was a stair up in the corner of the transept where you can get up to the triforium, and in them days the door was pretty well always open, and even if it wasn't, we knew the key usually laid under a bit of matting hard by. So we made our minds we'd be putting away some music in that next morning while the rest of the boys was clearing off, and then slip up the stairs and watch from the triforium if there was any signs of work going on. Well, That same night, I dropped off asleep as sound as a boy does. And all of a sudden, the dog woke me up coming into the bed and thought I now were going to get it sharp, for he seemed more frightened than usual. After about 5 minutes, sure enough, came this cry. I can't give you no idea what it was like, and so near too, nearer than I'd heard before, and a funny thing, Mr. Lake, you know. Would a place this close is for an echo, and particularly if you stand this side of it? Well, this crying never made no sign of an echo at all, but as I said, it was dreadful near this night. And on top of that, the start I got with hearing it, I got another fright, for I heard something rustling outside the passage. Now, to be sure, I thought I was done, but I noticed the dog seemed to perk up a bit, and the next there was someone whispered outside the door. And I very nearly laughed out loud, for I knew it was my father and mother that got out of the bed with the noise. Whatever is it, says the mother. Hush, I don't know, says my father, excited, like, don't disturb the boy, I hope he didn't hear nothing. So me knowing they were just outside, it made me bolder, and I slipped out of bed, crossed to my little window, giving on the close, but the dog, he bored right down to the bottom of the bed, and I looked out. First off, I couldn't see anything. Then right down the shadow under a buttress, I made out what I always say it was 2 spots of red. A dull red it was, nothing like a lamp or fire, but just as you could pick them out like the black shadow. I hadn't but just sighted them when it seemed we wasn't the only people that had been disturbed, because I see a window in a house on the left became lighted up and the light moving. I just turned my head to make sure and then looked back into the shadow for those red things, and they were gone, and all I peered about and stared, there was not a sign more of them. Then came my last fright that night, something come against my bare leg, but then that was all right. That was my little dog had come out of bed and prancing about, making a great to-do, only holding his tongue, and me seeing he was quite in spirits again. I took him back to bed and we slept the night out. Next morning I made out to tell my mother I'd had the dog in my room, and I was surprised after all she said about before how quiet she took it. Did you? She says, well, by good rights you ought to go without your breakfast for doing such a thing behind my back, but I don't know as there's any great harm done. Only another time you asked my permission, do you hear? A bit after that I said something to my father about having heard the cats again. Cats, he said. And he looked over at my poor mother, and she coughed and said, oh yes, cats, I believe I heard it myself. That was a funny morning altogether. Nothing seemed to go right. The organist, he stopped in bed, and the minor canon, he forgot it was the 19th day and waited for the venti. And after a bit on the deputy, he set off playing the chant for evensong, which was a minor. And then the Decani boys were laughing so much they couldn't sing. And when it came to the anthem, the solo boy, he got took with the giggles and made out his nose was bleeding, and shoved the book at me, what hadn't practiced the verse and wasn't much of a singer if I had known it. Well, things was rough for, you see, 50 years ago, and I got a nip from the countertenor behind me that I remembered. So we got through somewhat, and neither the men nor the boys weren't by way of waiting to see whether the canon in residence, Mr. Hensel it was, would come to the vestries and find him, but I don't believe he did. For one thing, I fancy he'd read the wrong lesson for the first time in his life and knew it. Anyhow, Evans and me didn't find no difficulty in sleeping up the stairs, as I told you, and when we got up, we laid ourselves down flat on our stomachs where we could just stretch our hands out over the old tomb. And we hadn't but just done so when we heard the verger that was then first shutting the iron porch gates and locking the south door west, and then the transept door. So we knew there was something up, and they meant to keep the public out for a bit. Next thing was the dean and the canon came in by their door on the north, and then I see my father and old Palmer and a couple of their best men, and Palmer stood talking for a bit with the dean in the middle of the choir. He had a coil of rope, and the men had crows. All of them looked a bit nervous. So they stood talking, and at last I heard the dean say, well, I've no time to waste, Palmer. If you think this will satisfy Southminster people, I permit to be done, but I must say this, that never in the whole course of my life have I heard such errant nonsense from a practical man as I have heard from you. Don't you agree with me, Mr. Hensel? As far as I could hear, Mr. Hensel said something like, oh, well, we're told, aren't we, Mr. Dean, not to judge others, and the dean said he gave a kind of sniff, and walked straight up to the tomb and took his stand behind it with his back to the screen, and the others they came edging up rather gingerly. Hensel, he stopped up on the south side and scratched on his chin. He did. Then the dean spoke, said, Palmer, he says, which can you do easiest, get the slab off the top or shift one of the side slabs? Old Palmer and his men, they spotted about a bit, looking round the edge of the top slab and sounding the sides to the south and east and west and everywhere but the north. Hensel said something about it might being better to have a try at the south side, because there was more light and more room to move about. And then my father, who'd been watching one of them, went round to the north side and knelt down and felt the slab by the chink, and he got up and dusted his knees and says to the dean, beg pardon, Mr. Dean, but I think if Mr. Palmer tried this here slab, he'll find it come out easy enough. Seems to me one of the men could prize it out with his crow by means of this chink. Ah, thank you, Worsby, said the man. That's a good suggestion. Palmer, let one of your men do that, will you? So the men came round and put his bar and bore on it, and just that minute they were all bending over, and we boys got our heads together over the edge of the triforium. There must have come a most fearful crash down at the west end of the choir, as if a whole stack of big timber had fallen down a long flight of stairs. Well, you can't expect me to tell you everything that happened all in a minute. Of course, there was a terrible commotion. I heard the slab fall out and the crowbar on the floor, and I heard the dean say, "Good God." When I looked down again, I saw the dean tumbled over on the floor. The man was making off down the choir. Hensel was just going to help the dean up. Palmer was going to stop the man, as he said afterwards, and my father was sitting on the altar step with his face in his hands. The dean, he was very cross. "I wish to goodness you'd look where you're coming to, Hensel," he says. "Why, you should all take to your heels. When a stick of wood tumbles down, I cannot imagine." And all Hensel could do, explain he was right away on the other side of the tomb, would not satisfy him. Then Palmer came back and reported there was nothing to account for this noise, and nothing seemingly fallen down, and when the dean finished filling out of himself, they gathered round. Except my father, he sat where he was. And someone lighted up a bit of candle, and they looked into the tomb. "Nothing here," says the dean. "What did I tell you? Stay, here's something. What's this? A bit of music paper and a bit of torn stuff, part of a dress, it looks like. Both quite modern, no interest whatever. Another time, perhaps, we'll take the advice of an educated man, or something like that." And off he went, limping a bit, and out through the north door. Only as he went, he called back angry to Palmer for leaving the door standing open. Palmer called out, "Very sorry, sir," but he shrugged his shoulders, and Hensel says, "I fancy Mr. Dean's mistaken. I closed the door behind me, but he's a little upset." Then Palmer says, "Why, where's Warby?" And they saw him sitting on the step and went up to him. He was recovering himself, it seemed, and wiping his forehead, and Palmer helped him up on his legs, as I was glad to see. They were too far off for me to hear what they said, but my father pointed to the north door in the aisle, and Palmer and Hensel, both of them, looked very surprised and scared. After a bit, my father and Hensel went out of the church, and the others made what haste they could to put the slab back and plaster in it. And about as the clock struck 12, the cathedral was open again, and us boys made the best of our way home. I was in a great taking to know what it was had given my poor father such a turn, and when I got in and found him sitting in his chair taking a glass of spirits, and my mother standing looking anxious at him, I couldn't help from bursting out and making confession where I'd been. But he didn't seem to take on naught in the way of losing his temper. "You was there, was you? Well, did you see it?" I saw everything, father, except when the noise came." "Did you see what it was knocked the dean over?" he says. "That what came out of the monument. You didn't? Well, that's a mercy." "Why, what was it, father?" I said. "Come, you must have seen it," he says. "Didn't you see a thing like a man, all over hair and two great eyes to it?" Well, that was all I could get out of him at the time, and later on he seemed as if he was ashamed of being so frightened, and he used to put me off when I asked him about it. But years after, when I was got to be a grown man, and we had more talk now and again on the matter, he always said the same thing. "Black it was," he said, "and a mass of hair, and two legs, and the light caught on its eyes." Well, that's the tale of the tomb, Mr. Lake. It's one we don't tell to our visitors, and I should be obliged to you not to make any use of it till I'm out of the way. I doubt Mr. Evans will feel the same as I do if you ask him. This proved to be the case, but over 20 years have passed, and the grass is growing over both Warby and Evans. So Mr. Lake felt no difficulty about communicating his notes taken in 1890 to me. He accompanied them with a sketch of the tomb and a copy of the short inscription on the metal cross, which was affixed at the expense of Dr. Lyle. On the center of the northern aisle, it was from the Vulgate of Isaiah 34, and consisted merely of the three words, Ibi Kuba Vat Lamia. So that was an episode of Cathedral History by M.R. James. And then I also I might do the other one tomorrow because it's getting very late and this one seems long, kind of. The story of an appearance and a disappearance. I might do that one tomorrow. So let's do your cards real quick. And I did do the other videos. I'm scheduling stuff though. I'm not going to just drop everything today. But let me pull the cards and then we can... I have 3 other subliminals I need to make tonight too. So I'm doing a series on Tudor Queens and... So I have to record the affirmations for those. And I'm starting to get tired. I'm working on this since the morning. Yeah, I might just rest and do the story of an appearance and disappearance tomorrow. Let us do this now, though. Let's see what your cards are. Let's do one more shuffle, and then we can continue. 5 of Wands is upright, so that's a conflict. 8 of Pentacles is upright. That's hard work, focusing on your work. And then Ace of Cups is reversed. There's like some blocked love feeling or something. Let me just draw one more card. Two of Wands is upright though. This is actually, it's gonna be like travel. This is like looking out the world. And like it's got a globe on it. So it's like, and then Four of Cups is upright. Is that right? Four of Cups? Yeah, Four of Cups is upright. So there's like some apathy, some internal conflict. And the Devil card. That one comes up a lot, the Devil. That's like feeling like karmically bound to something. And the Devil is there on both sides, I guess. But it's not a bad thing. It's like you know, it's like karmically bound to something, but it's also a lot of passion, lust. So a lot of what do you call it? It's not a bad thing. It means there's like a mutual attraction that's binding, but not in a bad way. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll talk to you soon.